We knew something was going on. We could hear the B-47s outside our building cranking up because they were departing the base. They were being deployed. The same with the tankers. We knew there was something really big going on. We didn't find out, though, really what it was until a day later. By that time, we were sitting with our 9 missiles as close to launch as we could without actually launching them.
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelley Lesher. At the end of summer, my partner and I decided to take a road trip before the academic year began and students started to arrive back on campus. We chose Cooperstown, North Dakota. What's there, you ask? Nothing. Nothing near, nothing far. In fact, Fargo is 102 miles away. Grand Forks is 85 miles away. But really, that's the point. We went to see the Missile Alert Facility, Oscar Zero, and Launch Facility, November 33. At one point, around 1,000 of these Minuteman ICBM missile sites were spread across the central United States. These inconspicuous underground missile silos made up the third leg of the U.S. nuclear deterrent triad. By the end of the Cold War, and with the signing of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START, the U.S. and Soviet Union agreed to reduce the number of nuclear weapons they held. Included were most of the missile silos and launch facilities in North and South Dakota. 4 missile sites have been preserved and open to the public: the Oscar Zero site in North Dakota and the Delta 9 site in South Dakota are Minuteman missile sites. There is a Titan II missile museum near Tucson, Arizona, and the most recent museum, Quebec 1, a peacekeeper site in Cheyenne, Wyoming. I've left a link in the show notes if you would like to visit any of them. Although ground-based missiles still make up the third leg of the U.S. nuclear triad, only about 400 or so Minuteman III missile sites are in operation today. After visiting Oscar Zero, I wanted to speak to someone who was there, underground, in charge of one of those missiles. So today on the podcast, I am speaking with retired Colonel Charles G. Simpson, who served as an officer in the United States Air Force from 1959 to 1989. His assignments range from aircraft maintenance officer to base commander to Chief of Staff for the 57th Air Division in Minot, North Dakota. I would like to make a note here. I skipped over some of Charlie's career in the Air Force, not because it isn't important or impressive, and certainly not because Charlie didn't talk about them, but because I focused on his nuclear assignments. The cut segments will be available as bonus content to our Patreon supporters, and you will hear how he speaks of these times with just as much pride as the ones I've included in this episode. When did you join the Air Force, and what made you join?
Well, I grew up in the Air Force. My dad was an Air Force chaplain. He served in World War II in Korea. I tried to go to the first class of the Air Force Academy in 1955, but I could not pass the eye test. I had a guaranteed appointment to West Point or Annapolis, and Senator Al Gore Sr., who was a good friend of my father, could have gotten me in there. And I said, no, I don't want to carry an M16 or an M1 rifle or be on a destroyer. So I went to University of Miami and got a degree in engineering and took our Air Force ROTC. Graduated in 1959, worked for 3 months at Pratt Whitney as a design engineer on a rocket and jet engines. Came in the Air Force in November 1959 over Thanksgiving weekend to Hanscom Field, Massachusetts, which is now Hanscom Air Force Base, as an engineer, but primarily as an aircraft maintenance officer. And did that for a little less than 2 years and saw that was not a good place in those days for a non-flyer officer to make it in the Air Force. Most of the people around me were World War II veterans or Korean veterans. Volunteered for intercontinental ballistic missiles in early 1961 and was chosen to go to school in September of 1961. By that time, Carol and I had been married about 9 months. So we headed down to Wichita Falls, Texas, Airport Air Force Base. Spent almost 6 months in training for Titan I missiles. And in those days, when they trained you in great detail. We spent the first 2.5, 3 months learning about very basic things about physics and electronics and mathematics in the Air Force and basic missiles. They used the Thor as an example. We learned all about the Thor. And then I spent 6 weeks in Titan I training, mostly with operations officers, launch officers. I was the only maintenance officer in my class. And from there, went to Mountain Home Air Force Base, Idaho, and started work there in a brand new Titan I ICBM system. But we hadn't even gotten the silos yet. We had 9 silos at 3 missile sites, a total of 9 missiles. Titan I was the old liquid-fueled, radio-guided, very complex, very hard to work on system. It took as many people to maintain our 9 missiles as it took to maintain 150 of the Minuteman at Grand Forks, for example.
Was this the missile that exploded out of the silo in Arkansas, the Titan I?
That was the Titan II, the follow-on. The Titan I was liquid oxygen and kerosene. The Titan II was a hypergolic combination, 2 fuels that when you mix together, they ignited and on contact, and they could be stored. Our missile, you couldn't store the liquid oxygen in the missile. So to launch a Titan I took about 15 minutes. To launch a Titan II took about a minute. A big difference.
That is a big difference.
Yeah.
How long did the Titan I's then last?
We were operational from mid-1962 to mid-1965. Not very long.
No, but that 15 minutes is a long period of time.
Well, and they were very vulnerable because they had to be raised above ground before they could be launched. They stayed in a silo, but you had to fill them with liquid oxygen and the fuel was already on, the RP-1, then raise them above ground and then lock a guidance antenna on and then launch them. So they sat above ground for about 2 or 3 minutes out in the open before they launched. And they weren't really accurate. They were very complex, hard to maintain. We had Atlas missiles at the same time. They were the same way. They were effective, but they were not near as effective as what came later.
You were an officer doing maintenance then?
In Titan I, I was, yeah, for the first 3.5 years.
Wait, I have to ask, how old were you when you were in charge of a nuclear missile?
Well, in 1961, I was 23.
So 23.
Yeah, and I was older than some people were. Now, we at the time, we had a squadron commander who was the head guy for all our missiles, who didn't trust people under 30. He insisted his launch officers all be 30 years or older. And that was a problem then because a lot of them weren't. So he paired them up so he had at least one of the 2 crew members was old enough to be mature the way he felt about it.
How old was this guy then?
He had made colonel when he was 24 years old in World War II.
Was that a battlefield colonel?
Yeah, it was. He was a fighter pilot. And it was strange because of that. I mean, he got explosive about it sometimes. If he found out there were 2 officers on alert and they were both under 30, he didn't like that. And he didn't trust enlisted folks either. It was sad. He didn't last long.
Uh-huh.
He was only there for about a year, and we destroyed a missile by accident because he caused us to, so he got to go somewhere else.
Tell me about that. How did you destroy a missile?
Well, we were doing after the Cuban crisis, which we went through. I was very involved with that in 1962. Shortly after that, we started a test program to verify the reliability of the system because we hadn't done that yet. We'd started to do it before Cuba and had to stop. And there was a lot of concern at SAC headquarters about that because they weren't very reliable. So we had to test every missile, and we'd have 2 successful exercises, filling them full of liquid oxygen, raising them topside, locking on the guidance, the whole process. 2 successful exercises. Most of them took 8 or 10 attempts to do that. And one of them failed one day. A helium line broke and cut off all the power of the missile. And this colonel, instead of sending his maintainers down to fix it, the guys who knew what they were doing, he sent the contractors down, the tech reps. And they didn't follow tech data. They just went in and started pulling out electronic drawers out of racks, took all the power off the missile. It dumped out the liquid oxygen in a silo. And all of a sudden we had a missile with a warhead on top of it sitting in a silo full of liquid oxygen. And that isn't very safe.
No.
So once we got that safe, he got relieved.
Oh, that's just one example of what could have gone wrong.
Could have gone wrong. Yeah, there were a lot of things that could have gone wrong. Nothing really did. I mean, we lost the silo in Damascus, but considering what we were handling for all those years, we really had no nuclear accidents. We had nuclear incidents by our definition.
What is the difference in the military definition of nuclear accident versus nuclear incident?
Well, accident, when I was in, had to do with the loss of control of the warhead itself, a detonation of some kind, the high explosive had to detonate, or of course, the warhead itself, or something like that, something catastrophic. A lost reentry vehicle or warhead or a damaged one, like in the case of Damascus, it was blown off the missile. Well, that's no big deal. I thought I turned that off.
We keep it real around here.
Yeah, it's a spam call, I'm sure. By definition, in those days, anything that was less than that was an incident. And there were different levels of incidents. There was what was called a broken arrow, which was an accident. And in our case, ours was a potential broken arrow, which is almost an accident.
What kind of paperwork was involved when you had a potential broken arrow? Or was that not at your level, like someone else dealt with that?
Oh, no, a whole lot. We had a very big investigation. Like any aircraft or missile accident, the investigation starts as soon as the thing is safe. It involves an outside agency, senior officer from somewhere else, and a team. They go into everything. It's a board. They review everything. They question people. They put you under oath. They write a report. They make recommendations. And it's a very complex thing. I was involved in several of those over the years, and they took a lot of time.
You were with the Titan I during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I was, yep, sure was.
So how did that play out for you?
Well, I tell people it was the scariest time in my life. My job was job control officer. I was the lieutenant who ran a 24-hour center that scheduled and tracked all the maintenance in the squadron. I had several non-commissioned officers working for me that worked consoles, a lot of communications. So we tracked everything going on in the missile field 24 hours a day. And that Saturday morning, when they started for us, I was at work, which was not unusual in those days. We were working 7 days a week. We had taken a missile off alert for an exercise at one of our sites. And our maintenance supervisor, who was a major, was out there watching that being done and getting it ready. It took about 8 hours to prepare a missile for an exercise because you had to make sure it was safe and you had to take the fuel off, put cameras in the silo to record everything that's going on, and take off the explosive ordnance, all those things. I got a call from a command post that said, Lieutenant, call the site and tell them to put Charlie 1 back on alert right now, no questions asked. That's all they said. So I said, yes, sir, Major. And I hung up and I called Major Grossolz out at Charlie 1 and I said, sir, I've been told by the command post to put Charlie 1 back on alert, no questions. He said, I can't do that. Well, sir, you better call the command post. He hung up. He called the command post. He called me right back in about 30 seconds. He said, it's going back on alert. And that's all we knew. We knew something was going on. We could hear the B-47s outside our building cranking up because they were departing the base. They were being deployed. The same with the tankers. We knew there was something really big going on. We didn't find out, though, really what it was until Kennedy spoke a day later. Then we knew exactly what it was. By that time, we were sitting with our 9 missiles as close to launch as we could without actually launching them.
Had you ever been to that point before then or after them?
Never before then to that point and never that close after that. A couple times after that, a little farther down the readiness curve, but not that close.
At this point, though, you had only been in your position a few years.
A few months.
A few months?
Yes, that was in October 62, and we had gotten our first missile in June 62. So they were brand new.
So even at that point, you knew that this was not an ordinary thing.
No way at all, no.
Okay.
Far from it.
Okay, so even being new, this was a scary situation, even without any information.
Yeah. We had 100 B-47s on our base. They all deployed to commercial airports around the country, loaded with nuclear weapons. We had 100 tankers on base. They deployed around the country. All the people on the base in the aircraft business deployed with them to maintain them. So the base all of a sudden became basically a ghost town. We had a missile squadron there with about 800 people in it, and that was it. And we were all on alert. You're guarding the base. You're doing everything to make sure we don't know what's going to happen. So
right.
Everybody's working 12-hour shifts or 24-hour shifts. So
wow.
It was a scary time.
You said they were B-47s that took off with the bombs?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you ever know a time when the B-47s took off with bombs again?
Well, in those days, we flew some alerts with bombers on airplanes. That stopped about a year later. It wasn't common. There was a thing called Chrome Dome in B-52s, where there were some airplanes on alert with bombs on board. And they stopped all that. So it was rare. Most of the time, they were flying training missions without bombs.
Do you think because of the information you had that you were more fearful of the situation than the ordinary person?
I think we were probably less fearful. We knew what was going on. We knew what could happen. We knew what the consequences were. But we also knew what our job was, and we were there to do it, no matter what.
Were you comforted that you had the ability to defend us?
We felt very sure about our deterrence, and as I did my whole 30 years in the Air Force, and it worked. We were convinced it was going to work, but at the same time, you never know when somebody on the other side isn't of sound mind and body. And
Yeah.
with Khrushchev and Castro.
Well, and you knew that your base was going to be a target.
Well, of course, yeah. Well, my wife was very concerned. She was expecting her first child, and she got calls from neighbors wanting to use our basement as a bomb shelter. She found out that they were assigned to certain people, and she told them that. And we lost a couple of friends over that because they didn't have basements.
Oh,
so, yeah.
Because you were in the Air Force, your basement was actually assigned to other people as a safety place?
Well, it was for us and other people for houses that didn't. We lived in base housing, and some had basements and some didn't. So they assigned people to shelters around the base, the families. Oh. A lot of families left. A lot of the families packed up campers or went back home to mama and things like that. So, but not all.
Did any families move completely after that, permanently?
Well, I don't know if, some may have gotten out of the Air Force after that. I don't know, but nobody that I knew of, the people I knew all, that was our business. We were supposed to do that. So, and part of our life.
What happened then in 65, you go to Grand Forks?
Well, what happened in late 1964, McNamara decided to close down all the Atlas and Titan I missiles. So all of a sudden, there are 18 squadrons around the country, a lot of people that need to be reassigned. And a team came around to each base and talked to us. And I put in on my piece of paper, my dream sheet, I put down, I want to stay in maintenance and go to Davis Mountain, Arizona. And what I got instead was operations at Grand Forks, North Dakota. I tell people I got part of which I got a 2-name base rather than a single name base. So in 1965, I drove my car up to Grand Forks to get on the housing list and came back, and shortly after that, packed up the 2 kids and the wife, and we drove to Grand Forks and moved into a house and started my 5 years there as a launch officer.
I think actually the moral of that story is when you fill out your dream sheet, don't put your actual dream.
Well, it worked a couple of times.
Okay.
What I did throughout my career is I would ask, give me the best job you have wherever it is. That was more important to me than someplace. And it worked. We had great assignments for our 30 years, all different places.
How many times did you have to move?
We actually moved 27 times total.
Oh my God.
We were on 9 bases. But on some bases, like at Mountain Home, we lived in 4 different houses. And that's about as hard to move as it is to move cross country.
Oh, yeah. We had to move once from an upstairs apartment to a downstairs apartment.
Yep.
And that move was horrific. It was really, really hard.
So I haven't moved now for 32 years. It's been a big change.
Yeah. How's that feeling? Are you getting itchy?
Nope, not at all.
Really?
You live in Breckenridge, Colorado at 10,000 feet. You want to stay here.
So what was your job then in Grand Forks? Did you work at the missile complex a little further away?
I was early when I got there, one of the first people to arrive. So because of that, it had nothing to do with experience or qualifications. They paired us up based on who came in first in our squadron. And the first 8 crews became evaluator crews. They were the crews that would check everybody else's ability to do their job. The next 15 crews became instructor crews. So I became an instructor crew. I was not a commander. We had, in those days, 3-man crews. Didn't have female yet. So we had a missile combat crew commander who was a major on most crews, an alternate missile combat crew commander, an AMCCC, which I was as a captain. I was qualified in both of the chairs, the commander's chair and the deputy's chair. And we had a deputy crew commander. And the reason we had 3 was that we're not allowed to sleep underground in those days. And therefore, they figured they needed 3 people out there. So 2 could be underground and 1 could be upstairs sleeping. So our alerts in those days there were 24 hours, but we worked 6-hour, 4-hour shifts so that somebody was always resting while 2 guys were wide awake. I started off as instructor. I was teaching new students how to be missile crew members. And I did that for the first year and a half. And then I became an evaluator. And we became the senior evaluator crew for the wing, which was the top crew in the wing to watch every other crew in the wing. So the 3 of us became the senior crew and did that for a couple of years. And then we changed to 2-man crews. And I became a crew commander with a deputy. And we still couldn't sleep underground, so we sent 2 crews on alert and stayed 40 hours and took turns underground then. But I did it for 5 years.
I want to talk about what it was like. What is this 2-man crew underground? Kind of what was your day like? Or what was your shift like when you had to do this?
Okay. And the 2-man crew part, which was started in 1968, we would show up at the base at the big missile building for pre-departure briefing at 7:30 in the morning, unless you were taking the second shift. And then you came in at 3:30 in the afternoon. You and your deputy would go in with 14 other crews. You'd be briefed on intelligence, weather, what's going on in the world, what's going on in the news, what your schedules are for the coming 40 hours, all of that. You got your vehicle, you got any classified material you had to take out, and you drove out to the site or helicoptered out to the site. Once you got to the site, and I went to all 15 sites at Grand Forks, you got to the site, you went through the gate after clearing security, and that was a long process in those days. We had code pages. We had to read numbers back and forth to the security guard topside or the crew downstairs. You talked to the facility manager or the sergeant who ran the topside. He was the guy who took care of everything upstairs. You talked to him about what's going on. You talked to the cook about what you wanted to eat while you were underground. And you talked to security about what's going on in the missile field. And then you went downstairs on the elevator and had changeover with the crew underground. And that took about an hour. And then they went home and you started your shift. Then 8 hours later, another crew came out, drove out that afternoon, and they took your place. You went upstairs and rested for 8 hours. And then the next 32 hours, you took turns back and forth doing that. The bad thing about the 40-hour tour was that if we went out at 7:30 in the morning, we came back at 3:30 in the morning 2 days later. So we were leaving missile sites in North Dakota in the winter, 3:30 in the morning, and driving back to the base. And that was a lot of fun. Yeah, especially in blizzards.
Yeah, how far is that drive?
The farthest site of Grand Forks was up at Alpha, northwest of the base. It was about almost 100 miles.
Ugh.
You could take 2.5 or 3 hours. Oscar was only about an hour and 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Now, if we were lucky, we got helicopters in daytime. No helicopters at night, but in daytime, you got to ride the helicopter. So that was a little better.
Well, and not in blizzards. They certainly wouldn't take you out in blizzards in a helicopter.
We flew in pretty bad weather sometimes, but not real bad blizzards, no. But your routine, your 8 hours, once you got downstairs and the other crew was gone, the first thing you would do is take off your gun because you didn't need it when you were down there, your 2 people. You had to carry a 38. And that was only when you had company in your launch control center. You took that off. A lot of crews got comfortable, took off their uniform shirts and put on sweats, things like that, because you're locked in this capsule underground and nobody's going to bother you. There's no video cameras in those days. Then you did the daily inspection. You had to check all sorts of equipment. It took about an hour. And there may be a lot of routine tests you had to run. And then you finally got to a point where, okay, now I can just sit back and do something else. We did things like, I was getting a master's degree at that time. We had a master's in industrial management at the University of North Dakota. You read, or you play chess, or you play pinochle, or you not allowed to sleep. So that was one thing you couldn't do. Your meals are brought to you. The chef would give you a menu and you tell him what you want. You bring it down, freshly cooked. And it was a fairly quiet 8 hours, except every half hour to an hour, there's some kind of a practice or training message over the alerting system you had to respond to. Or a missile would give you an indication. You might get a security indication that something's on a missile site and you didn't know what it was. You just knew there was an alarm that says you have an outer zone security. You would call up to the sergeant topside and say, send a strike team out and see what it is. And it was probably a rabbit or something like that. I never had anybody really come to my site during my 5 years. So never had anything that was real. But you occasionally had a missile that had problems, and when it came off alert, you got a red light on the missile, and you had to process that and call back to the base to job control and get maintenance out to fix it. And then you process maintenance when it came on site and kept in contact with them. So there were things that were going on, but probably 80% of it was quiet.
And that doesn't sound nearly as bad as I thought it would.
No, it wasn't bad. It was not exciting most of the time.
It definitely doesn't sound exciting.
No.
But when I was in Ukraine, we went to an old Soviet missile base, and they did not have it so nice.
Titan 1 was not like that either. Titan 1, you were busy all the time, so it was a big difference. Minuteman was and is very reliable and very stable and pretty quiet.
So there wasn't much excitement, no false alarms, no exercises, no.
No, you had false alarms, and especially early in the system. I say the first 2 years, a lot more excitement then because the system itself was maturing. A good example, when we first started, we only had 2 launch control centers. So we had a lot of contractors out hooking up the other missiles, doing things like that. And one day we got alarms on all 10 of our missiles they were launching. And we knew they weren't, but we got the lights that said they were. And we went through the inhibit procedure to stop launch and all that. And they finally tracked down the problem was Minuteman II, the system we call Minuteman II, the Deuce system at Grand Forks, had one of the first hard disks anywhere on a computer. It was a big hard disk, about 18 inches across. And they found out that the first one they put in Golf Zero was warped. And that's what was causing the indications. Oh. And they solved it after a few days. We had things like that, and we had problems with the early Minuteman II didn't stay on alert very long. The guidance systems were not very good. Not uncommon to have 5 maintenance teams out of 10 in our flight working on missiles. And that got resolved after about 3 years. And after that, the rate was like 99.9%. But before that, it was not near that good. And there were other things that happened. Yeah.
How long were the Minutemans in commission?
They still are.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, the first Minuteman came on alert in 1963. It actually came on during the Cuban Crisis in 62 at Great Falls, the first flight in October 62. They've been alert ever since. The missiles aren't the same. That was Minuteman I. We had Minuteman I at Malmstrom, Great Falls, Montana, at Minot, North Dakota, at Cheyenne, Wyoming, at Ellsworth, Rapid City, South Dakota, and at Whiteman in Knob-Noster, Missouri. And then they put in Minuteman II at Grand Forks, which was a newer system, a different ground system by Sylvania. And then he went back and retrofitted Malmstrom, Ellsworth, and Whiteman to Minuteman II missiles, which became the Force Mod system. It was the old control system underground, but it was a missile we had at Grand Forks. And then in 1970, they began emplacing Minuteman III missiles, first at Minot and Grand Forks. And in the end, we had all Minuteman III missiles as we started to phase out the wings in the mid-90s. So by 1998, we were down to 3 missile wings. We have now still today with 150 missiles at Great Falls, Montana, 150 at Cheyenne, 150 at Minot. Those missiles, they've been there since 1970, but they really aren't the same missiles. They've been taken out of the silos and refurbished and modified and new guidance systems and things like that. It's the old Minuteman III system from 1970, but it's not the old system. It's much more modern than that. And they're still there.
And we know it works.
And we test them all the time.
So describe what a missile field would look like. But since we're talking about Grand Forks, let's just, what would this field look like? How big is it? Does the control center and the missile, are they next to each other?
Okay, a Minuteman wing at Grand Forks, we had 3 squadrons. Each squadron had 50 missiles. 446 was up north. The sites were A through E. The 447th was in the middle of the state, just west of the city of Grand Forks. And that was the next 5. And then Oscar down at the bottom was in the 448th. And that was the KLMNO, Lima, Mike, November, and Oscar. The sites range from 40 miles to 100 miles from the base. Each squadron, as I said, had 50 missiles and had 5 launch control centers. Each squadron had 5 flights. Each launch control center controlled 10 missiles. So its 10 missiles were within 8 to 10 miles of its point, so scattered around it. A squadron had 5 of those with each one. We took up about a third of North Dakota with 321st.
Oh, wow.
It was a pretty good sized field.
What I didn't realize, because when I visited the Soviet base, the missile was directly next to the launch system.
And that's the way Titan II is, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But the Minutemans are not that way.
No. As a launch crew, you never saw a missile unless you went out there to watch a maintenance team or for training. Now, the missile was 8 miles away or 10 miles away, different directions. Your only connection to it was underground cabling.
With these large missile fields, what happens if one of the control centers goes offline or is destroyed? Does that mean that they can't launch their 5 missiles anymore?
No, each one of the 5 launch control centers in a squadron is interconnected to all 50 missiles. So any two can do everything. Actually, a single launch control center can actually launch the missiles with airborne support. There are all kinds of backup systems. So if you lose one launch control center, somebody else takes over your missiles and watches them for you. And in the case of Grand Forks, you saw on the console, there were two different panels, each with 10 missiles on it. It was your primary 10 missiles. The other panel had 10 other missiles, and you had a switch at the bottom. You could change which flight deck showed. You could show any of the 5 flights in your squadron. So somebody's watching all the time.
The other thing I found really interesting was the lockbox in the underground part.
The red safe?
The red safe, yes. So
I've got one of those in my TV room.
do you?
Yes.
Do you keep the remote in there and both you
No,
and your
I
wife
don't.
have to lock it and unlock it together?
No. I got that when I stepped down as director of the Association of Air Force Missileers 2.5 years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I guess now. That's what they gave me as a present, going away present. It's from Grand Forks. It's one that was at Grand Forks. So,
that's great. So could you explain what the lockbox is and what's in it? What that's part of the changeover procedure, from my understanding.
I'm not sure it's the same nowadays, but it's close, I'm sure. In my day, part of the process, when you come downstairs, once you go through the process of checking certain things in the capsule with the other crew, you don't check very much because you just make sure everything is still there. You do the real inspection after they leave. But then you're all armed, and the off-going crew unlocks their 2 locks on the red safe, and they take out the launch keys and the authentication documents. These are sealed documents. There's a number of them, and they're all coded. And there's an inventory list that they have in a binder. And you check to make sure that every one of those documents is in the safe, that they're not cracked or partly open or damaged or anything like that. They're totally sealed. You make sure the launch key is the right launch key. And then you put them back in the safe and put your locks on. And once your locks go on the safe, then now you're in command.
And are these special locks or are they just like padlocks?
When I started, we had a rotary combination lock, a 3-number combination. And the nuclear surety people were worried about that because as you turn the dial, people can stand behind you and see the numbers. So we got a new lock that covered all the numbers, but just the one little spot where the number you're unlocking with is. You can still see it, but it was harder to see. Then they went to a digital lock later on, which they use now. That is, I don't know if it's 4 or 6 digits. I think it's 4 digital lock. They're regular, high quality combination locks, very strong steel, very hard to get into unless you know the combination. Pretty secure.
Is there any concern that someone would forget their combination in the stress of war?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I get flustered remembering my combination to my gym locker sometimes. Yep. And I can't imagine if it's nuclear annihilation that I'm going to remember a 4-digit code.
It happened, and we evaluate a crew every year. Every single crew got evaluated by me or somebody that was an evaluator every year, about a 4 to 6 hour evaluation, always ending up with about an hour and a half war sequence. And of course, you've got to unlock the safe and that. And it got very tense. And there were people that really, it was like real world. And you forget you're in a trainer. You think you're underground. And there were people that forgot it occasionally. I never had one that failed to remember it, but it delayed the launch. And we had people fail because of that. They couldn't get the lock open in time, and they had to meet time requirements, even though the other 4 launch control centers can launch the missiles. When you're evaluating somebody, they've got to launch the missiles. Nobody can take their place. So if they can't get the lock open, they fail, which means they are no longer qualified to pull alert, and they have to go through training and they go back on alert again. So, but it did happen occasionally, not often, but every once in a while.
Oh, wow.
I probably gave, 300 or 400 evaluations, and it probably happened once or twice was all.
Oh, so at that point, does the person get a demotion?
Well, it's not good for your career, but I know some people like General Lawrence, he failed an evaluation once. It didn't hurt him very much. It depends on what happened and your attitude too. It was not uncommon, the pass rate was very high, but there still were people that failed, and it's still that way. It was a very tough evaluation, as it should be. It's nuclear war, so you don't want to do it halfway.
No. All through your career, was the age of the men and women in these positions consistently young, like under 30? Was that a normal age for missileers?
Not initially. When I started, of course, in Titan 1, we had a lot of pilots who came out of aircraft being phased out, B-47s and early B-52s, B-58s. We had lieutenant colonels and majors as crew commanders. And it was the same way at Grand Forks initially. My crew commander was a major. At that time, I was a 6-year almost captain, 5.5 years in the Air Force. And it took a while to get junior officers in. By the time I was a squadron commander in the late 70s, we had no longer had anybody from the Vietnam days. We get captains and majors in who had flown in Vietnam. By the late 70s, they were all gone. We had very few, in my squadron, for example, at Ellsworth, I had no majors on a crew force. I had captains and lieutenants, that was all. During my 10 years as squadron commander in 1979, I made a second lieutenant a crew commander, first time ever in that squadron. That was a big step because we had no senior officers. We had just lieutenants. So we picked the most qualified second lieutenant, and I made him the crew commander.
Did you have to be an officer to be in one of these silos?
In Titan 2 and in Titan 1, we had 2 officers and 2 NCOs. In Minuteman, it's officers, only officers.
Really?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That actually makes me feel better.
No, you got to be a commissioned officer.
Okay.
Well, talk about enlisted, but it's never happened. Yeah.
That actually is very surprising.
But the young guys who handle the nuclear weapon itself and put the missiles in the silos and all that, they're not officers. They're all young, 18, 19, 20-year-old.
You should have let me feel safe when I said I felt safe.
Well, they're good. They're very good at what they do.
You were still in Grand Forks during the Vietnam War.
I tell people I fought Vietnam in North Dakota.
You had mentioned most of the B-52s were overseas.
Yep. We became the prime nuclear deterrent for the United States during Vietnam. Minuteman did, because there were very few bombers on alert.
So that one of the 3 legs of the triad then was gone.
Yeah, basically it was. There were a few on alert, but not many.
Did you feel more pressure then?
I don't think pressure was the right word. We just felt, hey, we're doing a very important job, and hey, we're now number one. The bomber guys are busy doing something else.
So did you feel a little superior to the pilots at that point?
You can't feel superior to pilots. They won't let you.
Oh, okay.
I've got a son-in-law who's one, so I can say that.
Was being in a missile considered a lower kind of class job than being a pilot? Or is it just kind of like in the Air Force, being a pilot is always the best thing you can possibly be?
You just said it. Being a pilot
Gotcha.
is, yep. And it's always been that way. We used to call them rated officers and non-rated officers. And being a non-rated officer like I am was not near as good as being a rated officer.
Okay.
I tell people that being a missile officer, you are the only non-rated combat officer in the Air Force. In those days you were. And you are as good or better than any pilot is. And it's gotten better, but we've always talked about being second-class citizens. And it still happens. It's just the way it is. I put a couple of junior officers in braces and talked to them about that. They were bomber pilots and called me things that they shouldn't call me as a missileer. So yeah. I actually wanted to be in missiles and space when I first came in. I was never really gung-ho to be a pilot. I was going to be one if I had to be commissioned.
Okay.
But for some reason, I was never, and maybe because when I tried to fly airplanes, I wasn't very good at it. My brother went to the academy. He was a pilot, so he took care of that spot.
And another branch wasn't going to work for you?
Well, as I said before, when Al Gore Sr. offered me West Point or Annapolis, I said, I don't want to carry an M1 rifle or be in a destroyer. I said, my dad was in the Air Force. I grew up with blue uniforms around, and that's where I wanted to be. And it worked pretty well. Well, I went from Grand Forks, I went to Vandenberg first for 3 years. I was the senior Minuteman evaluator for operations crews, for launch crews. My job there was to travel up to all the 6 Minuteman bases. We go in for 2 weeks every 6 months and evaluate 14 to 15 crews and maintenance also, all the functions, and give them a thorough evaluation. And my job during that time was the senior operations evaluator for the command as a major. That was a really good job. It was a tough job at times because it was always tougher if the wing didn't do well. You wanted to go into a wing and watch them be outstanding. And because they're all your friends. You get to know all of them as you're around them. And especially, I had competed twice in the missile competition out of Vandenberg when it was at Grand Forks. And we won it 1 year.
I have to ask, what is a missile competition?
That started in 1967. The bombers had had competitions since General LeMay's days, back in the 50s. Since we couldn't actually go to war and test how good we are, they started competitions where every bomb wing competed in wartime exercises, and they gave trophies out for the best bomb wing for how they dropped their bombs and killed their targets. We started that in missiles in 1967. What it amounted to then, and it still goes on, is that the wing selects 2 or 4 launch crews. They select several maintenance teams in all sorts of disciplines, security forces, and they go through exercises and compete for score. And when I did it years ago, we all competed at the same place at Vandenberg during a 1-week period. And every night they would post your score. At the end of the 6 days, you'd see who the winner was. And we won the competition in 1969. It's to pick the best wing, the best crew, the best maintenance team, and to let us have a chance to show how we do our jobs and show other people how we do it. And we can't go to war, but we can do that instead. So it's been going on since 1967.
It sounds like fun. It also sounds like fun to get together and meet the other wings.
Well, it is. Yeah, it is. It's a fun time. It's a stressful time during the event. You have a great time. Every wing has a mascot. They've got cheers they use. They've got everything like that. And the last one I went to, there probably were 1,000 people there. It was a combination now of a bomb and missile competition. So you got all the bomber crews and maintenance people and the missile crews and maintenance people. And you're all together.
And they allow women now as part of the crew.
Oh, yeah. That's been that way for a long time.
I saw at the Oscars site, the bathroom had to finally get a door on it because women were allowed underground.
That took a long time. That took a long time, but it did.
And I thought, why wouldn't you just want a door on the bathroom anyway, even without women? That would kind of be nice.
Well, we had a privacy curtain, like a shower curtain.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that the women classed the place up a little bit for you.
Oh, they did very much.
Then you go to accuracy and reliability planning for the Minuteman.
Yep.
So you spent a lot of time with the Minuteman.
Oh, I did. Yeah. At the end of my 3 years, I went to what was called ballistic missile evaluation. Our job was to look at the test results, all the test flights out at Vandenberg, all the tests we did, the ground testing we did. Everything was done in the way of testing missiles, and arrive every year for every system, Minuteman 1, Minuteman 2, Minuteman 3, Titan 2, with the war planning factors, how accurate and how reliable. If we go to war, how many missiles are going to launch and how close are they going to come to their targets? And we had to prepare a report about 1.5 inches thick every year on each system, take it up to the Joint Chiefs and brief it, get it approved by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and every year went through that with every system. So I learned a lot about Minuteman problems and testing and all those things during that period. And I had some great people working with me. The nice thing we had was I took 4 people with me from the squadron out of Vandenberg. They were evaluators because they were the kind of people you want. And we were allowed to do that. We could hand select people for jobs like that in those days.
And why did you leave that position then?
Well, you don't stay anywhere very long.
Okay. Well, 27 moves. Says that, yeah.
I was there 4 years, which is about normal at Omaha at SAC headquarters in those days. I just made lieutenant colonel, and I got selected to go to Air War College in 1977.
Then you became base commander.
No, I went to Ellsworth.
Ah, okay.
I was still lieutenant colonel. We drove up to Ellsworth, reported in. I knew all the guys in personnel that were my counterparts that handled us. We had missile assignments officers at the headquarters, and they kind of watch your career for you. And I told the ones I knew, just send me the best place to become a squadron commander at some point. They couldn't tell you where it was for sure, but it looked pretty good at Ellsworth. I might have to wait 3 months, 6 months, a year, who knew? We drove up there, and I just said, I'm going to stop by the missile building to say hello to my new boss before we check into the hotel. And I'm dressed in my tennis shorts and a tennis shirt. It's June in South Dakota. It's 105 degrees. I'm towing my Alfa Romeo sports car behind my Volvo. When you pull into the missile building, I leave Carol and the kids in the car. I go in and I meet Colonel Meyer Garber, who I'd never met before. And I walk in and salute him in my civilian clothes. He said, Charlie, can you come down to the wing commander's office for a minute? And I said, dressed like this? He said, yeah, it's important. So we walked down the hall to the wing commander, who I'd known before, not very well, but I knew. And I salute. And he says, Charlie, can you take command of a squadron Monday? And Carol said, I came out with the biggest smile I've ever had.
Well, I guess that was your best chance of getting command.
Yeah, it sure was. Yeah. And so I became a commander my first day. Yeah. That job was 2 years. You've got 60 crew members, lieutenants and captains who work for you. You've got one ops officer, a major who's your assistant, and one clerk typist, and that's it. And your job is to run that part of the missile wing, the crews.
How old are you at this point?
That was 1978, so I just turned 40.
Jeez. Yeah.
Yeah. So 2 years of that, 1979, I got selected for colonel. And so I made colonel, and they moved me up to be the assistant commander for operations, which is, they're now called operations group commanders. I was the assistant. We were in charge of all the operations in that wing, so all the 3 squadrons and everything else under the wing for operations. And for part of that time, there was no commander, so I was it. I was by myself in that job. Did that for about a year and a half, and then became the base commander for Ellsworth.
I was going to say, where does a colonel go?
Well, a colonel in those days, it looked like, I hoped, I'd move up to be a wing commander eventually. But about that time, the new commander of SAC came in and said, I don't want wing commanders who are not below-zone promotees. And I was not. I'd not been selected early for any promotion. So I knew what my fate was. So when the wing commander called me and said, Charlie, you're the new base commander, I said, Dick, I don't want that job, but if that's what it is, I'll take it. So, and I loved it. I did it for 7 years.
So what's a wing commander? Like, how many bases are under your control then?
A wing commander is the senior commander for either the bombers or the missiles on a base like that. He's got everything in the one base. He's got the 3 missile squadrons, the maintenance, the operations. And in the case at Ellsworth in those days, he was also called the installation commander. He was in charge of everything on the base that wasn't part of the bomb wing or the missile wing, all the support activities.
So how's that different than a base commander?
Well, the base commander worked for him, and the base commander ran the base. The installation commander was in charge of everything, but the base commander ran the base for him. So I was the guy who ran everything on base, the security police, the fire department, the people that maintained roads and grounds, maintained all the houses on base, made sure that we had a personnel system, we had finance, we had all those things, all the non-mission stuff.
Oh, so the base commander does all the boring things.
Yeah, yep.
And the wing commander does all the fun Air Force stuff.
That's right. Yep.
That makes more sense now.
Except it was fun being a base commander, too. Well, I got to run the golf course and the base gym and all that stuff, too. So.
I guess the job would be very different if you were at war and were running a wing.
Yeah, I did that in Europe. I'd been a base commander at Ellsworth for about a year and almost 2 years. And I got a call one day from a colonel assignments major, a major down in San Antonio. He said, your dream sheet says you want to go to Grenell's cruise missiles. I said, yeah. He said, how about Comiso? I said, what's that? He said, it's a new base we're going to build, and you'll be in charge of it. I was there 14 months. And it was probably the most interesting assignment I had, because I got there April 30th, 1983, the first permanent person on the base. There was no base there yet. It was a bombed out German fighter base, and we were building a new cruise missile base on. So I show up, and the only people on the base are contractors building buildings and 12 Air Force non-commissioned officers, well, 10, and then 2 Air Force officers sent down there from Ramstein, Germany, to get the contractors moving on temporary quarters because they were way behind schedule. Because I had 800 people coming in 10 days to start activating the base.
And there were no quarters?
There were no quarters, no. We were building porta cabins, which are like trailers with no wheels.
Ugh.
So we got that going, and 10 days later, I welcomed almost 800 people to the base. And we built the base from the ground up.
Wow. So what's the difference between a cruise missile and one of the missiles in a silo, say in North Dakota?
Well, the ground-launched cruise missile we had between 1983 and 1991. We fielded those to counter the Soviet. They were fielding SS-21s and some other missiles in Eastern Europe. They were pointing those things at London and Paris and places like that. And Carter tried to sign a treaty with them, and they wouldn't sign it. So Reagan followed Carter up and fielded the cruise missiles and the Army system at the same time. They basically were a medium-range, 1,500-mile nuclear-armed missile that could reach into Russia. We had 6 bases. They were mobile in that a missile flight in those days, rather than 50 missiles out in North Dakota, a missile flight was 16 missiles on 4 mobile launchers with about 90 people that went out and dug into a field somewhere and camouflaged it and hid and waited to go to war. So for a guy who had been on alert at Grand Forks, all of a sudden he's got a shovel and an M16, a different world for him, or her
Yeah.
in that case. Yeah, it was a totally different world. And they loved it. Everybody did. But it was a different experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So did you ever get your wing command?
Nope. I knew I wasn't going to. So that's why I kept being a base commander. By that time, I was past that point. I went from 14 months at Comus. We went to Turkey for 2 years. And that was a fighter base. That was a totally different lifestyle for me.
How is it different being a fighter base?
Well, you mentioned the war in Europe. I got to go through their wartime exercise. We had 50 F-16s at the base in wartime. A wartime exercise, a team would come and watch us for 2 weeks, and as realistic as possible, we had to load those 50 airplanes with conventional bombs. They had to go up and fly and drop bombs on a target. They had to fly air-to-air combat against other airplanes. Then at a certain point, nuclear war started. We had to bring them back on the base, take off the conventional bombs, load the nuclear bombs, take off the nuclear bombs, put them back in storage, load a dummy bomb, fly a mission with a dummy nuclear bomb. And all this time around the base, there were explosions going off. They're gassing us. There are foreign troops coming in with guns. I mean, it was like real war. So it was a little different than it was back in the States.
That sounds a lot different than
It was, yep.
the war games.
Yeah, I got to crawl around on my hands and knees carrying an M16. So yeah, it was.
I thought that was the whole point of going into the Air Force, is that you didn't have to do that.
And it finally happened.
What I find interesting is that, you start your career in 1962 in missiles, but then you end in 1989. That is the Cold War period.
It is, yep. Well, it ended shortly after I retired.
How did you see things change during that period? Did military attitudes follow the changes in public attitudes in the Cold War?
I don't think it changed much until I retired. Throughout that whole time, we never foresaw what happened in late September, I guess, when the wall fell down. I'd been retired about a month when the wall fell down. I didn't foresee that, and I was amazed when I saw it on television in our new house. I think up till that time, it was business as usual. My time in Europe, I saw it up close more so because on a cruise missile base, you got to face communists face to face because they were protesting around your base all the time. The Communist Party financed big protests at our base in Sicily. So I stood watching 10,000 of them throw Molotov cocktails at me and say nasty things about Americans. And
Wow.
So, and that didn't change until I retired. So they were still the bad guys. And I don't think it changed at all during my whole time.
And you didn't see changes in funding?
That depended on the president. Reagan did a lot for us. When he became president, it changed enormously. I was a base commander when he became president at Ellsworth. I became base commander about that time. When I took over from my predecessor, we had giant backlogs in maintaining things like roads, houses. We had dormitories where the bathroom didn't work. We had sergeants living in rooms that they had to go down the hall to a bathroom because theirs didn't work. And we couldn't afford to fix them. Reagan came in, and all of a sudden we had money for everything. I had, both in Sicily and in Turkey, I had the largest construction budgets in the Air Force. In Turkey, I was building new buildings all over the base because it hadn't been touched in years and years. So we built dormitories and hospital and everything on the base. Had lots of money for it. So that did change over the years, off and on. And during the Reagan years, which happened to be my last 7 years in the Air Force, it was a good time to be in that business.
The missiles are at the end of their lifespan. And there is now this nuclear posture review that has come out.
Yep.
What is your thoughts on the missile leg of the triad and the argument of if we do or do not need that third leg?
Well, we're still, right now, GBSD, ground-based strategic deterrence, is the big new ICBM. And that is now in the development phase through Northrop Grumman. The newsletter of the Missile Association, we've had that in the newsletter the last 3 issues. That is going to be the replacement ICBM. And it's going to go in the same base as we have missiles right now. Just we aren't sure exactly the format, exactly the manning, but it'll be the same basic mission. I feel very strongly that we need all three because the bombers get diverted often for conventional missions. It'll always be that way. And the bomber force is getting smaller and smaller. We're going to close down more and more of the bomber units. We're closing down the B-1s. So we'll have the new B-21 and some B-52s, which are going to be 100 years old sometime here pretty soon and still fly. The submarines are a great asset, but I'm one of those that still thinks that a submarine is not as good a deterrent as a ground-based missile, because a submarine can do things in some ways better, and they can hide, but they have a limitation. They can't hide and do things better both at the same time. If they start making noises, all of a sudden the other side knows where they are, so are they still there? You don't know. So I'm very big on we still need all three legs.
Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you'd like to address or you'd like listeners to know about?
Let me just say what the question I was always asked.
Yeah.
Does it bother you to have your hand on the keys and to be able to go to war with nuclear weapons that could destroy the world? And my response is always, my job is to make sure that never happens. My job is to make sure our nuclear force is so strong, nobody will ever try to counter it. We'll never have to turn those launch keys, and we'll never destroy the Earth.
So that actually leads me to another question that people worry about, which is, we saw this a lot before the last election.
Yeah.
And that is, we talked about the age of the men and women that are down in these missiles. You're trained to turn the key on an order,
yep,
regardless of what that order is, where it comes, as it comes down.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
You can't tell if that's a lawful order or not.
Yes, you can.
Okay.
The process is so complex and so detailed that you know it's a lawful order.
So are there checks to make sure that you are given a correct order and it's not a fake order, or it's not a test, or it's not a fluke? Is that a reasonable concern that people have, that there's a 20-year-old that's going to turn a key on a wrong order?
No, it's not, because
okay,
number one, it takes 4 people in 2 places to launch missiles. So if you worry about collusion, that sort of thing, it would take a pretty involved process. You've got all kinds of things to stop that. We're under a program called human reliability. Your commander, your bosses watch you all the time. Anything that's unusual, they report. You may end up talking to the doctor, the psychiatrist, or you may be disqualified, depending on what it is. If you've got a problem with finances at home, or maybe a problem with your marriage, you may be taken off alert because you're not dependable. So that's always watched. That takes care of the individual, the personal part of it. The red box you talked about, the red safe, those authenticators are the launch codes, but we don't know what they are, and we don't open them. And what's in there is no good unless you get a message saying it matches those in the safe. We don't have the numbers to do with. And there's another aspect of it. There's some other switches in the control center that you put in some other numbers that you don't even have. The president has those. So the message has to come from the president, the National Command Authority, with those numbers and letters, along with what's in the red box. And those combined, they get to guarantee you that it's a valid order. There's no way around that we ever see. Anybody can take over. And I feel very strongly about that.
I hope you enjoyed listening to my chat with Colonel Simpson as much as I enjoyed speaking to him and learning more about his time with the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Thank you, Charlie, for taking time out of your golf schedule to speak to me. A special thanks goes out to Robert Branting, the Ronald Reagan Missilman Missile State Historic Site Supervisor, say that 10 times fast, who gave us an amazing tour of Oscar Zero, was able to answer our questions, and put me in touch with Colonel Simpson. Thank you to our listeners for all of your support and encouragement along the way. Please leave us a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen to us, as it helps others find our podcast. A big thanks to our Patreons, whose contributions gain them access to exclusive bonus content and currently fund our podcast streaming service and our webpage. You can find more about us on mynuclearlife.com. And until next time, I'm Shelley Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.